The most dangerous mistake an officer can make is believing a badge tells the whole story. The late afternoon sun stretched across Interstate 64 just outside Richmond, Virginia, painting long golden shadows over the steady flow of traffic as commuters hurried home after another ordinary Tuesday. For most drivers, it was simply another evening measured in miles, exit signs, and the quiet rhythm of tires rolling over pavement. But for one officer parked on the shoulder beneath a line of oak trees, the next few minutes would become the defining moment of an entire career. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted the collar of his dark blue patrol uniform as he watched vehicles pass through the radar display mounted inside his cruiser. He had been with the department for 7 years, long enough to believe experience always spoke louder than patience. Every traffic stop, in his mind, was another opportunity to prove that he controlled the situation before the first conversation even began. When a black sport utility vehicle traveled past his position, Brooks narrowed his eyes, activated his emergency lights, and pulled onto the highway. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the polished rear window as the driver calmly signaled, reduced speed, and guided the vehicle safely onto the wide shoulder. There was nothing hurried about the movement, nothing nervous. Everything about the driver's actions suggested confidence built from years of discipline. Brooks noticed it immediately, but instead of making him curious, it made him suspicious. He stepped out of the cruiser, resting one hand near his duty belt as warm summer air carried the distant sound of passing tractor-trailers. The woman behind the wheel lowered her window before he reached the driver's door. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, professionally dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer over a light blouse. Her posture relaxed, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel exactly where they could be seen. Her expression was composed, neither intimidated nor argumentative, as though unexpected interruptions were simply another part of life. "Good afternoon, officer," she said in an even voice. "Is there a problem?" Brooks barely acknowledged the greeting. His attention lingered on the expensive vehicle, the immaculate interior, and the quiet confidence that seemed almost out of place in his eyes. "License and registration," he replied without returning the courtesy. The woman nodded once and slowly reached toward a leather organizer on the passenger seat before handing over the requested documents with deliberate, careful movements. Brooks glanced at the driver's license. Angela Williams. Richmond address. Everything appeared valid at first glance, yet something about her calm demeanor continued to bother him. Most people looked uncertain during traffic stops. Some apologized before he even spoke. Others nervously explained where they were going. Angela Williams did none of those things. She simply waited, meeting his eyes with steady respect that neither challenged nor surrendered. Brooks looked back toward his cruiser, then again at the woman. "Where are you headed today?" he asked. "Home," Angela answered with a slight smile. "It's been a long day." Her answer was brief, polite, and completely ordinary. Yet Brooks frowned as though expecting something more complicated. Around them, traffic continued flowing beneath a bright Virginia sky, while the emergency lights cast alternating colors across the pavement. A family sedan passed slowly in the far lane. A delivery truck disappeared over the next rise. Everything about the afternoon remained peaceful except for the growing tension that neither passing drivers nor distant commuters could possibly understand. Angela remained exactly as she had from the beginning, shoulders relaxed, voice measured, eyes attentive without appearing defensive. She had learned long ago that dignity did not need to announce itself. Sometimes the strongest response was simply refusing to let another person's assumptions determine your own behavior. Brooks, however, mistook composure for concealment. The silence between them stretched a little longer as he studied her face, convinced that confidence without explanation had to mean something was being hidden. He had no idea that every decision he made from this moment forward would quietly set into motion consequences neither of them could yet see, and that before the sun disappeared beyond the Virginia horizon, the meaning of authority itself would look very different than it did standing beside that lonely stretch of highway. Officer Daniel Brooks walked back toward his patrol cruiser with Angela Williams's license and registration in his hand, glancing once over his shoulder before opening the driver's door. He slid into the seat, entered the information into the computer, and waited for the familiar loading screen to finish. Everything returned as valid. No warrants. No expired registration. No alerts. It was exactly the kind of routine result that usually brought a traffic stop to a polite conclusion. Instead of feeling satisfied, Brooks found himself staring once more through the windshield at the black sport utility vehicle resting quietly on the shoulder. Angela had not moved. Both hands remained visible on the steering wheel exactly where he had first seen them. She was not searching through compartments, making phone calls, or appearing impatient. She simply waited. Somehow, that calm confidence unsettled him far more than nervous behavior ever could. He stepped out again as another wave of traffic rolled past, carrying the sound of engines into the warm Virginia air. The emergency lights continued flashing across the pavement, coloring the side of Angela's vehicle in alternating blue and red reflections. Brooks stopped beside the driver's window and handed back the documents. But instead of ending the encounter, he asked another question. "Is this your vehicle?" Angela answered without hesitation. "Yes, officer. It is registered in my name." Brooks nodded slowly, studying her expression. "Where are you coming from?" "Work." "What kind of work?" Angela paused only long enough to choose her words carefully. "Public service." The answer was truthful, yet it revealed almost nothing. Brooks expected elaboration, perhaps even an attempt to impress him with a title or explanation. None came. Angela's voice remained steady, respectful, and remarkably free of frustration. The silence that followed seemed louder than the passing. Traffic. Brooks shifted his weight and glanced toward the rear of the vehicle before looking back at her. "Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Angela looked directly at him, her expression unchanged. "Officer, may I ask whether there is a specific reason?" Brooks answered quickly. "I am conducting my investigation." Angela nodded once. "I understand. I simply wanted to understand your reasoning." Without another word, she unfastened her seatbelt, opened the door carefully, and stepped onto the shoulder. She stood beside the vehicle with relaxed posture, leaving a respectful distance between them. Her movements reflected years of discipline rather than hesitation. Brooks noticed the confidence again, and once again he interpreted it as something other than quiet professionalism. A few passing drivers slowed slightly as they noticed the traffic stop, while a delivery van moved into the next lane before continuing down the interstate. The afternoon remained peaceful, almost ordinary, yet the atmosphere around the shoulder of the highway had grown noticeably heavier. Brooks circled the vehicle slowly, looking through the windows without touching anything. Every detail appeared neat and organized. There were neatly stacked folders on the rear seat, a reusable coffee cup in the center console, and nothing that suggested urgency or concern. Angela watched without interrupting. She neither argued nor attempted to influence his decisions. After another long silence, she spoke in the same measured tone she had used from the beginning. "Officer Brooks, every decision we make during moments like this matters more than we realize." Brooks looked up, surprised that she had used his name from the badge on his uniform. "I know my job," he replied. Angela gave a small, almost sympathetic nod. "I believe you do. I only hope you allow the process to guide your decisions instead of assumptions." Her words were calm, almost gentle, yet they lingered in the quiet air long after she finished speaking. Brooks felt an unexpected urge to prove that his instincts were correct. Rather than viewing her patience as cooperation, he convinced himself that it concealed something he simply had not discovered yet. He reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, requested another unit to respond for assistance, and watched the distant highway as he waited. Angela remained exactly where she was, composed beneath the fading afternoon sunlight, while somewhere beyond the next exit, events already in motion were steadily making their way toward the lonely stretch of interstate where two very different ideas of authority were about to collide. The quiet shoulder of Interstate 64 seemed suspended outside of time as Officer Daniel Brooks lowered the radio from his shoulder after requesting another unit. The confirmation from dispatch came back within seconds, informing him that assistance was only a few minutes away. Brooks acknowledged the response with a short reply before turning his attention back to Angela Williams. She remained exactly where he had asked her to stand, neither restless nor impatient, watching the passing traffic with the same calm expression she had carried since the moment he activated his emergency lights. It was a confidence that Brooks could not explain, and because he could not explain it, he became increasingly determined to justify his own instincts. He slowly walked another circle around the sport utility vehicle, carefully looking through every window. The interior remained spotless. Organized folders rested neatly in the back seat. A folded jacket lay across one side, and a travel mug sat securely inside the center console. Nothing suggested hurried movement or suspicious activity. Every ordinary detail somehow frustrated him more than if he had actually found something unusual. Angela quietly observed him without interrupting. She understood that arguments rarely changed the direction of a conversation once assumptions had already taken control. Years of public service had taught her that patience often revealed more about another person than confrontation ever could. A gentle breeze moved through the trees beyond the highway as another stream of commuters passed by. Some drivers briefly glanced toward the flashing patrol lights before continuing on their way, unaware that an ordinary traffic stop was gradually becoming something neither participant would forget. Brooks stopped near the front of the vehicle and looked directly at Angela. "I am going to continue my investigation," he said. "I need you to remain here until my backup arrives." Angela answered with the same steady voice that had never risen above normal conversation. "I will cooperate, officer." She paused for a moment before adding, "Just remember that every additional decision deserves the same level of care as the first one." Brooks folded his arms briefly before replying, "I know how to conduct a traffic stop." Angela inclined her head slightly. "I hope so. Good judgment protects everyone involved." Her words contained no accusation and no sarcasm. If anything, they sounded like advice offered to someone she genuinely hoped would make the right choice. That unexpected kindness only strengthened Brooks's belief that he needed to press further. He convinced himself that calm behavior was an attempt to avoid scrutiny instead of recognizing it as quiet self-control. Within minutes, another marked patrol vehicle appeared in the distance, its emergency lights reflecting across the afternoon traffic before slowing onto the shoulder behind Brooks's cruiser. Officer Michael Turner stepped out and approached with an easy, professional stride, immediately noticing that the woman standing beside the vehicle appeared completely composed. Brooks quickly summarized the situation, explaining that he believed additional investigation was necessary even though dispatch had reported no outstanding issues with the vehicle or the driver. Turner glanced briefly toward Angela before returning his attention to Brooks. "What specifically are you seeing?" he asked in a low voice. Brooks hesitated for only an instant. "Something feels off." Turner looked again toward Angela, who politely acknowledged him with a small nod before returning her attention to the highway. There was nothing confrontational about her posture. Nothing suggested urgency. Even the silence surrounding her seemed deliberate rather than uncomfortable. Turner quietly replied, "Sometimes people are simply calm." Brooks remained unconvinced. He stepped back toward Angela and said, "Officer Turner will remain here while I continue reviewing a few things." Angela met his eyes without the slightest hint of resentment. "That is your decision," she answered. "I only ask that every action today reflects the standards your badge represents." Those words settled over the roadside with unexpected weight. Neither officer realized that beyond the next interchange, several unmarked government vehicles had already entered the interstate for reasons entirely unrelated to the traffic stop. And within only a few more minutes, the quiet confidence Angela had carried from the beginning would finally begin to make sense to everyone standing beneath the fading Virginia sky. Officer Daniel Brooks followed the distant line of traffic for a moment before lowering his hand from the radio. The afternoon light had begun to soften, turning the highway into a ribbon of gold stretching toward the Richmond skyline. Beside the black sport utility vehicle, Angela Williams remained exactly where she had been asked to stand, her posture relaxed, her attention drifting occasionally toward the passing vehicles before returning to the officers. She did not check a watch, reach for a telephone, or display the slightest sign of impatience. The stillness surrounding her contrasted sharply with the growing uncertainty inside Brooks. He believed experience had taught him to trust his instincts, yet nothing in front of him matched the suspicion he continued to feel. Officer Michael Turner quietly observed the scene without speaking. Years of patrol work had taught him that routine stops often ended exactly as they began, with a citation or a warning and a polite farewell. This stop felt different, but not because of the driver. It felt different because every answer Angela gave was calm, direct, and entirely consistent. Brooks opened the rear door of his cruiser and removed a standard incident notebook, reviewing the driver's information once more as though another look might reveal something he had overlooked. Every detail remained ordinary. Valid license. Valid registration. No outstanding alerts. No indication of criminal activity. He closed the notebook slowly, unwilling to admit that the facts no longer supported the direction in which he had taken the stop. Angela watched quietly before speaking in the same measured voice that had never once carried frustration. "Officer Brooks, may I ask one question?" Brooks looked up cautiously. "Go ahead. When this encounter is over, what do you hope people will remember about it?" The question lingered in the warm air. Brooks frowned slightly. "I am just doing my job." Angela offered a respectful nod. "Doing the job well protects both the public and the officer. That is why every decision matters." Before Brooks could respond, Turner glanced toward the interstate. Several dark sport utility vehicles had entered the highway from a distant interchange, traveling together with steady spacing. They were not using emergency lights, yet their coordinated movement immediately caught his attention. Brooks followed his gaze but assumed they were simply government vehicles passing through the area. The small convoy gradually slowed as it approached the shoulder where the patrol cars were parked. One after another, the vehicles activated discreet amber safety lights and pulled in behind the second patrol unit with deliberate precision. Brooks straightened immediately, surprised by the unexpected arrival. The doors opened almost simultaneously. Several professionally dressed officials stepped out carrying identification cases and document folders rather than emergency equipment. Their movements were calm, organized, and completely unhurried. None of them looked confused about where they were or why they had arrived. Turner quietly whispered, "Do you know who they are?" Brooks shook his head, trying to maintain his confidence. One senior official with silver hair walked toward the roadside, his attention moving briefly across the patrol vehicles before resting on Angela. His expression immediately softened into professional respect. Without hesitation, he stopped a few feet away and offered a courteous greeting. "Good afternoon, Chief Williams. I apologize for the delay." The words settled over the roadside with startling silence. Brooks blinked, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Turner slowly turned toward Angela, whose calm expression never changed. She simply acknowledged the greeting with a polite smile and replied, "Thank you for coming. We will allow the process to continue exactly as it should." In that single quiet moment, the confidence Brooks had mistaken for concealment suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. And although he still did not understand the full picture, he realized that the ordinary traffic stop he believed he controlled had quietly become something far larger than himself. Officer Daniel Brooks felt the weight of every pair of eyes shift toward him as the words echoed across the shoulder of Interstate 64. "Chief Williams." The title repeated silently in his mind, while the senior official extended a respectful handshake to Angela. She accepted it with quiet professionalism, offering only a courteous smile before returning her attention to the officers. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only the same calm presence she had carried since the beginning of the stop. The afternoon breeze continued moving through the trees beyond the highway, and traffic flowed past as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet for Brooks, the entire scene suddenly felt different. The confidence he had interpreted as concealment now revealed itself as something else entirely. It was the confidence of someone who had never needed to prove who she was. The senior official turned politely toward Brooks and Officer Michael Turner before presenting official identification. "Good afternoon, officers. We are here to meet Chief Angela Williams following a scheduled regional leadership conference." Brooks accepted the identification with slightly trembling hands, carefully reading it before returning it without a word. Turner remained silent beside him, his expression reflecting surprise rather than judgment. Angela looked toward Brooks with the same respectful composure. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "nothing about my position changes the importance of your responsibility. Every traffic stop deserves professionalism because every citizen deserves professionalism." Brooks opened his mouth to answer but found no immediate response. The words he had prepared only moments earlier no longer seemed appropriate. He had expected confrontation, excuses, or demands. Instead, he found himself standing before someone who continued speaking about principles rather than authority. One of the accompanying officials quietly asked Angela whether she wished to conclude the stop immediately. She shook her head. No. The process should finish correctly. The same rules apply today as they would for anyone else. The official nodded without hesitation. Brooks lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. Chief, I was not aware. Angela answered softly. That is exactly why titles should never determine how people are treated. The sentence settled over the roadside with remarkable clarity. It was neither criticism nor accusation. It was simply a reminder of the standard every officer promised to uphold when accepting a badge. Officer Turner glanced toward Brooks, recognizing the significance of what had just been said. The silence that followed felt longer than any conversation. Even the passing vehicles seemed distant beneath the warm evening sky. The senior official addressed Brooks in a calm, professional tone. Chief Williams has requested that today's encounter be fully documented through normal departmental procedures. Body camera recordings, dispatch communications, and written reports should all be preserved according to policy. Brooks immediately nodded. Yes, sir. There was no argument because there was nothing to argue against. Everything being requested represented ordinary procedure. Angela folded her hands comfortably in front of her. Documentation protects everyone, she said. It protects the public when mistakes occur, and it protects good officers when they make sound decisions. Accountability is never meant to be personal. It exists because trust must be stronger than assumptions. Brooks slowly looked toward his patrol vehicle where the body camera recording continued capturing every passing second. For the first time that afternoon, he stopped thinking about proving himself right. Instead, he began replaying every decision he had made since activating his emergency lights, realizing that the moment defining this encounter had never been discovering who Angela Williams was. The defining moment had been every choice he made before he knew. The atmosphere along the shoulder of Interstate 64 changed almost imperceptibly after the introductions were complete. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody rushed to take control. Instead, every person present seemed to understand that the next few minutes would be defined not by authority, but by procedure. The senior official quietly spoke with the members of his team, while Officer Michael Turner stepped back beside his patrol vehicle, allowing everyone enough space to continue professionally. Chief Angela Williams remained exactly where she had been standing, composed beneath the fading afternoon sunlight. She looked toward Officer Daniel Brooks with the same calm expression that had greeted him at the beginning of the traffic stop. Officer Brooks, she said gently, I appreciate that you remained here and allowed the process to continue. That is the first responsibility of every public servant. Brooks nodded slowly, still trying to reconcile the events unfolding before him. Chief, I should have handled this differently. Angela did not immediately answer. She watched another line of vehicles pass down the interstate before speaking again. Every officer will make difficult decisions. The question is never whether we make mistakes. The question is whether we recognize them early enough to change course. Those words settled heavily in Brooks's mind. He replayed each moment from the beginning of the stop, remembering every assumption that had quietly influenced his choices. None of those decisions had been based on evidence. They had been based on instinct, and instinct without discipline could easily become unfair treatment. One member of the visiting team approached the patrol cruiser and politely requested that the body camera recording, dispatch log, and incident notes be preserved according to departmental policy. Brooks immediately acknowledged the request. There was nothing unusual about it. The documentation that protected the public also protected officers whenever procedures were followed correctly. As he carefully verified the recording status on his equipment, Brooks realized that the camera had captured every conversation exactly as it happened. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing needed to be reconstructed from memory. The truth already existed in real time. Chief Williams noticed him looking toward the camera and quietly said, "Evidence is never an enemy of good policing. It is one of its strongest partners." Brooks looked back at her. "I understand that now." She offered a slight smile filled not with satisfaction, but with encouragement. Understanding is only the beginning. What matters is what happens after understanding. The senior official completed a brief conversation with Turner before returning to Angela. "Chief, transportation is ready whenever you are." Angela nodded, but remained where she was for another moment. She turned once more toward Brooks. This encounter will be reviewed through the same process that applies to every officer. I will not direct that process because fairness requires independence. Brooks listened carefully. He had expected influence. Instead, she was deliberately removing herself from the decision. That choice revealed more about her leadership than any title ever could. As the officials prepared to leave, the last rays of sunlight reflected across the highway and illuminated the flashing emergency lights that had marked the beginning of the stop. They no longer felt like symbols of control. They felt like reminders of responsibility. Brooks watched Chief Williams walk calmly toward the waiting vehicle, realizing that the most important lesson of the afternoon had nothing to do with discovering who she was. The real lesson was discovering who every officer was expected to be whenever a badge, a uniform, and another person's dignity met on the side of an ordinary American road. The drive back to the precinct felt longer than Officer Daniel Brooks could remember, even though the distance had not changed. The flashing emergency lights had been turned off miles earlier, yet the conversation on the shoulder of Interstate 64 continued replaying in his mind with remarkable clarity. Every question he had asked, every assumption he had made, and every opportunity he had ignored seemed impossible to escape. Officer Michael Turner drove behind him in silence, understanding that some lessons were learned only when there was nothing left to say. By the time they entered the station parking lot, the evening sky had darkened, and the ordinary rhythm of shift changes continued as though it were any other day. Officers greeted one another, supervisors reviewed reports, and dispatch radios carried familiar voices through the hallways. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Brooks knew that his day had already become anything but ordinary. Before he had even removed his duty belt, his immediate supervisor requested that he complete a detailed incident report while the events remained fresh. There was no accusation in the request. It was standard procedure whenever an encounter required additional review. Brooks sat quietly at his desk, opened the reporting system, and began documenting the stop from the very beginning. For the first time, he noticed how many of his decisions had relied upon personal interpretation rather than observable facts. Each sentence required him to separate what he had actually seen from what he had merely believed. That distinction became more difficult with every paragraph. Across the building, technicians had already begun securing the body camera recording, patrol vehicle video, radio communications, and dispatch logs according to departmental policy. Nothing was being hidden. Nothing was being altered. The review would rely upon evidence instead of memory. Brooks understood that reality offered no shortcuts. His supervisor eventually stepped into the office and quietly pulled up a chair beside him. "Daniel," he said calmly, "this is not about finding someone to blame. It is about determining whether every decision reflected our training." Brooks nodded without looking away from the report on his computer screen. "I understand." The supervisor folded his hands. "Do you believe you had enough objective information to continue extending that stop?" Brooks remained silent for several moments before answering honestly. "Looking back now, no. I believe my instincts were enough." The supervisor gave a thoughtful nod. "Experience is valuable, but experience must always be disciplined by facts. Otherwise, confidence becomes assumption, and assumption eventually damages public trust." Those words echoed the lesson Chief Angela Williams had shared only hours earlier. Different people, different places, the same principle. Brooks slowly leaned back in his chair, realizing that accountability did not begin with punishment. It began with honesty. Late that evening, an internal administrative review was formally opened according to established departmental procedures. Brooks received written notification that the incident would be evaluated independently using all available evidence and applicable policy. The process was routine, professional, and impartial. No special treatment existed because the driver happened to be a police chief. No special protection existed because the officer wore the uniform. The same standards applied equally to everyone involved. As Brooks gathered his belongings before leaving for the night, he paused beside the patrol cruiser parked outside the station. He looked at the badge reflecting faintly beneath the parking lot lights and finally understood something he had overlooked throughout the entire afternoon. A badge could grant authority, but it could never replace judgment. Without disciplined judgment, even the smallest routine encounter could quietly become the moment that defined an entire career. Several weeks passed before the administrative review reached its conclusion, And throughout that time, Officer Daniel Brooks continued reporting for duty under standard departmental procedures while investigators examined every available piece of evidence. Body camera recordings, dispatch communications, written reports, patrol vehicle video, and witness statements were reviewed carefully and independently. No single opinion carried more weight than the documented facts. That approach reflected the principle Chief Angela Williams had defended from the very beginning. Accountability was never supposed to depend upon rank or reputation. It depended upon truth. Brooks found himself watching portions of the body camera recording more than once, not because anyone ordered him to do so, but because he wanted to understand the moment where confidence had quietly replaced objectivity. Each replay revealed details he had overlooked in real time. Angela had answered every question respectfully. She had complied with every lawful instruction. She had never attempted to provoke an argument or use her position to influence the encounter. The evidence did not simply show what happened. It showed how easily assumptions could shape decisions when discipline gave way to personal interpretation. One morning, Brooks was notified that the review board had completed its findings. The panel determined that portions of the traffic stop had been unnecessarily extended after the original purpose of the stop had been resolved, and that several investigative decisions were not sufficiently supported by objective facts. Corrective action was issued according to departmental policy, including formal disciplinary measures, mandatory retraining, and the removal of certain field responsibilities while additional evaluation took place. Brooks accepted the decision without protest. For the first time since joining the department, he understood that accountability was not designed to destroy a career. It existed to protect the profession from repeating preventable mistakes. Chief Angela Williams received a copy of the completed findings through official channels, yet she made no public celebration and offered no criticism of the officers involved. Instead, she submitted a recommendation that the incident be incorporated into future leadership and patrol training as a practical lesson in procedural fairness, communication, and impartial decision-making. Her recommendation surprised many people within the department because it focused entirely on institutional improvement rather than personal punishment. During the following month, a regional training conference brought together supervisors, patrol officers, and academy instructors from across Central Virginia. One section of the curriculum examined real encounters that demonstrated the importance of evidence-based decision-making. Without sensational language or unnecessary drama, instructors discussed how routine interactions could gradually change direction when assumptions replaced observable facts. Brooks attended the session quietly from the middle of the room, listening as experienced trainers emphasized that respect shown at the beginning of an encounter often determined how the entire interaction unfolded. At the conclusion of the presentation, Chief Williams addressed the audience for only a few minutes. She spoke calmly about public trust, reminding every officer that most citizens would never remember the wording of a statute or the number printed on a badge. They would remember how they were treated. She explained that fairness was most meaningful when offered before anyone knew a person's profession, influence, or title. As Brooks listened, he realized that the most important lesson from that afternoon on Interstate 64 had never been about recognizing a police chief. It had been about recognizing the equal dignity carried by every person standing on the side of an ordinary American road, long before anyone asked who they were. Nearly 1 year after that quiet afternoon on Interstate 64, the story of the traffic stop was no longer remembered because a police chief had been involved. It was remembered because it became an example of how an ordinary encounter could either strengthen or weaken public trust depending upon the choices made in a matter of minutes. Across the department, new academy recruits now studied the incident during ethics and procedural justice training. The names of the people involved mattered far less than the lessons they represented. Instructors reminded every new officer that professionalism was measured long before anyone discovered a person's title, profession, or influence. Respect offered only after learning someone's identity was not true professionalism. It was simply delayed recognition. Officer Daniel Brooks completed every requirement established through the administrative process. The additional training challenged many assumptions he had never realized he carried into daily patrol work. Classroom discussions, scenario-based exercises, and conversations with experienced field training officers gradually reshaped the way he evaluated routine encounters. He learned to separate instinct from evidence, confidence from certainty, and authority from responsibility. The lessons were uncomfortable at times, but they were honest. Instead of allowing the experience to become a source of resentment, Brooks accepted it as the defining moment that forced him to become a more disciplined public servant. Chief Angela Williams never spoke publicly about him by name. Whenever colleagues or community members asked about the incident, she always redirected the conversation toward institutional accountability rather than personal criticism. She believed that lasting trust was built when organizations demonstrated the courage to examine their own decisions with fairness and transparency. That philosophy gradually influenced leadership meetings, patrol briefings, and community outreach programs throughout the region. Officers were encouraged to ask themselves a simple question before making difficult decisions. Would this action still be appropriate if the person standing before me turned out to be someone I deeply respected? More importantly, would it still be appropriate if they were simply an ordinary citizen whose name I would never know again? Those questions became quiet reminders that dignity could never depend upon status. One autumn afternoon, Brooks attended another regional conference where Chief Williams addressed a room filled with officers, supervisors, and civic leaders. After the presentation concluded, he approached her privately. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no audience waiting to witness the conversation. He thanked her for allowing the process to remain professional instead of personal. Angela listened before offering the same calm smile she had shown on the roadside many months earlier. "Growth begins when honesty replaces pride," she said. "Every community deserves officers who are willing to learn as much as they are willing to lead." Brooks nodded with genuine gratitude. As he left the conference center, he realized that the greatest consequence of that afternoon had never been the disciplinary findings recorded in his personnel file. The greatest consequence was that he would never approach another traffic stop in the same way again. Somewhere beyond the city, thousands of vehicles continued traveling the highways of Virginia, each carrying people with different stories, different professions, and different lives. None of those differences could ever be seen through a windshield alone. Every encounter would begin with uncertainty, but it could always begin with respect. In the end, the badge did not become smaller because accountability existed. It became stronger, and the quiet truth that remained long after every report had been filed was simple. The law earns its greatest honor not when it discovers who someone is, but when it chooses to treat every person with dignity before it ever asks their name.